Welcome Exiles, this is FX Killer here with another video for you, and I've got to tell you this video has been long awaited and much requested. Hopefully you have seen my last two videos on weapon analysis and you'll know that they are quite full of information, as is this. I've went ahead and broken this video into sections because there is a lot of information in this. You can find links below if you want to just skip to the section you're interested in. So here's a look at the weapons we're going to be doing today. You can see we have the new Black Ice broadsword and longsword. We also have the existing religion weapons as well as the new glacier crack. We're also going to look at the star metal sword, dagger, spear, and hammer, as well as the exceptional and flawless versions of them, which you'll see why later. And we're also going to look at the hardened steel version of those same weapons. So the hardened steel sword, dagger, spear, and hammer, and the exceptional and flawless versions of those. And last but not least, we're also going to look at the new named weapons, which are the Deathbringer Axe, the Tellus Lament, and the Kingslayer Polearm. Before we do anything else, I want to show you guys how these weapons were tested. So first what I did was set up a structure, a tier 1, and I tested each weapon on the structure to test how much durability it took and how much damage it took, as well as spawning in NPCs and mobs, several different kinds of mobs, to test the durability and damage the weapons were using on the mobs. So now that you know how this data was obtained, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Wow, yeah, so there's a lot of numbers there, and if you just stare at this, it definitely is way too difficult to really glean any information from. So luckily I have went ahead and broken it down, and we're going to go ahead and dive into that right now. So to begin, we're just going to look exclusively at the left side of this Excel spreadsheet. You can see we have the durability, the damage, and the armor pen, as well as the estimated total hits and damage versus a mob, which is just the durability and the damage sort of multiplied, as well as the total hits and damage versus structures, which is basically the same thing, as well as the respective material. I put bars with a star sign sort of to show that that's any given material, as well as the type, and then of course, as always, the efficiency versus both mobs and structures. Now, you might remember before that we had one efficiency number and that was sort of all around, but this time I've factored armor penetration into the efficiency as well as how much durability each weapon uses per mob or structure type. So you'll find that this efficiency number is a lot more accurate now. I mentioned before that we have the exceptional and flawless weapon types as well, and luckily I was able to find the blacksmiths that had these weapon types, and I was able to verify that they did in fact use 16 and 12 bars respectively, as you can see here. Alright, well, let's go ahead and analyze this. So starting at the top, we can see that the glacier crack obviously blows away the old weapons. You're going to get an estimated 150,000 damage versus structures with it, and it has a pretty high efficiency versus mobs, but it does use about 2 durability per hit on mobs, whereas it only uses 1 durability per hit against the tier 1 building. We already knew that the glacier crack used hardened steel bars, so it should be no surprise that it is now the best religion weapon. And I also want you to note that high 70% armor pen, which is going to come into play later. Moving on to hardened steel, testing showed that it uses only 1 durability for most NPCs as well as on structures, which gives it a very high base efficiency as well as a very high damage per weapon. In other words, since you're only using about 1 durability per hit, these weapons tend to last quite a while and do quite a bit of damage. You can see that they cost 20, 16, and 12 bars respectively, as we already saw from the recipes. And interestingly enough, looking at daggers, we noticed that they actually do double damage to structures. Testing showed that the base damage on daggers either isn't accurate or it just does double damage on structures. I'm not sure which, but the data here clearly shows that the daggers are not working correctly against buildings. If we go a bit lower, we can see that the base damage of the hammer is actually the highest, easily the highest, versus both mobs and structures, as opposed to the lowest on daggers on mobs and structures, even with that double bonus. That said, I want you to notice the massive gains in damage and armor pen that you get from the exceptional and flawless, especially in the hammer. Not only that, but looking at the spears, we can see that they all have 0% armor pen, which is actually really bad, and we'll see why later. Moving down to star metal, we have the same 1 durability per NPC and 1 structure that hardened steel did, and they all have the 20, 16, 12 bar structure as well. Again, we tested that daggers had double efficiency on structures, doing double damage. Not sure if this is intended, but that is how it's working. I want to draw your attention again to the higher damage and armor pen on the hammer, which again is the highest in the category. Additionally, the star metal spears do have armor pen, unlike the hardened steel. Again, not sure if that's an oversight or intended, but the spears don't have too high of armor pen, except really for the flawless. Now take a look real quick at this flawless star metal hammer. 86 armor pen with 126 damage. This actually trumps the glacier crack with 93 damage and 70% armor pen to become the highest armor pen and highest base damage weapon, not counting of course the black ice longsword, in the game. Moving down to black ice, we noticed that they did have very easy materials of only 20 black ice each, and maybe because of that they use 2 to 3 durability on each NPC, although they do only use 1 durability per structure hit. This high damage but low durability makes a pretty low efficiency rating for these, and they do break pretty fast. So although they are good in quick encounters against low armor targets, they do break quickly, although the easy materials tend to make up for that. I've noticed no difference between the longsword and the broadsword, but I did put both here just because. Last but not least, let's look at the named weapons real quick. I was unable to find a recipe for the Deathbringer axe, but based on other axes, I assumed that it would be 30 bars. Now I did test them all, and they used about 2 durability per mob and 1 durability per structure, which is reflected in the hits and damage. The Tellus Lament has almost the same numbers, but a slightly higher efficiency than the Deathbringer axe, even with its lower damage, probably as a result of its armor penetration, but more likely as a result of its lower cost. The Kingslayer polearm does make it the best investment for your Kinscourge Heart with 1380 durability, and it also has a nice chunk of armor pen at 46%. Honestly, all these weapons are pretty subpar, but I guess if you have nothing better to spend your Kinscourge on, they're not such a bad idea. Now before we move on to the next section, we need to talk about armor penetration. Now you might remember from my old video that armor works on a diminishing return system. So what that means is the more armor you get, the less it actually reduces. I know it sounds complicated, but it'll make sense in just a second. So to obtain this data, I enlisted the help of Miss Firefly.
Hello.
And what we did was, we put on all the different sets of armor and tested the damage that would be taken with 0 strength at all these armor types. Using these numbers, I was able to fit a polynomial equation to them, which I used to calculate the estimated effects of armor pen. Just as before, I took this equation and then used my X input as the armor penetration and armor to be able to predict the effects of armor penetration on different armor types. Before we move on, I just want to show you what I meant by diminishing returns. You can see on this graph here that at each armor type, a certain amount of damage was mitigated. And we can see that the first 75 armor that you get is going to mitigate nearly 50% of all damage incoming. However, the next 50 to 70 armor is only going to mitigate 10 to 15% more damage. So this tells us 2 things. 1, that high armor isn't always that great. And 2, that armor penetration is super important, because penetrating through that high armor is going to get you into that sharper curve range, hence doing more damage. So now that we actually know what armor pen does, and we can see the curve of the armor effect, we're able to actually predict how much damage each weapon will do against a certain set of armor. So what I've shown here is the predicted damage per weapon type for each set of armor. Doing some analysis here, we can draw a few conclusions. First off, looking at the religion weapons, we can see that once we go over fur or medium armor, the damage really doesn't change with the glacier crack, making it a very good weapon for basically anybody over 50 armor. If we look in the hard and steel weapons, we can see significant drop off in the sword and dagger and even in the spear range. But if we look at the hammer, we can see that the hammer preserves most of its damage, especially in the flawless and exceptional hammers. Moving on to the star metal, we see much of the same. The swords lose most if not all their damage, more than half, once you're in a high armor area. Daggers are pretty much useless, and the spears only manage to hang on because they have some decent armor pen. Yet again, we see that the hammers are far superior to anything else, doing almost all of their original damage, and again this is due to the high 75 and 86 armor pen found on the exceptional and flawless hammers. If we move down to the black ice, we see a very dismal picture. Once an enemy is past about 50 armor, the damage on the black ice broadsword falls off significantly. Once your opponent hits 74 to 75 armor, you're barely getting half of the damage of the sword, and versus an enemy in Star Metal or Silent Legion, you're getting only 50 damage. We can see that the named weapons are next to useless, doing a meager 50 to 40, 40 to 34, and barely 60 damage against high armored targets. Some special things I want to point out is that dagger damage is almost non-existent at high armor tiers. Now this is the way that the numbers worked out, and maybe the daggers do a little bit of damage, but based on this you can see that daggers are completely useless for anything but harvesting hide. The other thing I want to point out is that armor penetration has never been more important in this game, because now if you try to face an enemy that does have high armor and you're using just a sword or spear, you're going to have a much harder time killing them because you don't have a high armor pen weapon. That makes the Glacier Crack and all the hammers very valuable in this expansion. Moving on, I'd like to highlight a strange behavior from spears. Now, many players are already aware of this, but for those who aren't, I want to show you something. Now, I tested this with every spear type, and slowing down the audio, you can actually hear that spears actually can hit multiple targets at once, multiple times. This is achieved by thrusting the spear and moving the mouse cursor sideways. This can make the spear especially useful for farming NPCs in camps, killing animals, or in group PvP. I'm not sure if this behavior is intended or not, but I did want to highlight it very briefly just to show people who might not be aware. If you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. In conclusion, things have definitely changed in the Frozen North. The advent of higher armor has made armor penetration much more important. Previously, many people asked about DPS. Hopefully, this chart shows you that DPS is entirely dependent on what armor your opponent is wearing versus what weapon you're using. For nakeds and low armor people, the Black Ice Broadsword is going to be superior. For any armor above medium armor, fur armor, or anything close to it, the Glacier Crack and the exceptional and flawless Star Metal hammers are superior. What this means is you definitely want to try your best to get a high level blacksmith in the north as soon as possible to get those best weapons in the game. Not only that, but hammers knock people down, so for PvP, hammers are superior anyway. Last but not least, I want to make it known that I'm a little upset about the homogenization of the recipes. All of them using the same 20, 16, and 12 bar system doesn't really make sense, because the hammer has almost 3 times the durability of a dagger, yet the dagger is almost worthless for anything else except farming hide. It would really be nice if some of these costs were adjusted in the future to reflect the usefulness and durability of the weapon types. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If there's any other questions you have, please ask. And due to popular demand, I have made this Excel spreadsheet available for download. You'll find the link in the bottom of the video description. As always, be sure to leave me a like, subscribe if you can, and stay tuned for the next video.